Awakened consciousness transforms hidden abilities into normal functions. Since ancient times, there have been talks of hidden powers, faculties that seem extraordinary: telepathy, intuition, perception of the future, healing, influence over reality. For some, they are myths; for others, gifts reserved for a chosen few. But there is a deeper truth, more unsettling and more real. These powers are not hidden, they are active. They just function unconsciously every time you sense something before it happens. Every time you feel a presence, an intention, or a change without anyone saying it. Every time your internal state alters a conversation, an opportunity, or an outcome, you are using one of these capacities, not as a trained power, but as an automatic reflection of your vibration. The problem is not having powers. The problem is not knowing that you are using them, nor from where, nor with what consequences. This audiobook was not created to promise magical abilities or to feed fantasies. It was created to reveal what happens when consciousness changes frequency, when the mind stops being noise, when emotion stops being chaotic, when energy organizes itself. At that point, capacities that previously seemed exceptional begin to manifest as something natural. Here, you will discover that the so-called powers do not appear to impress others. They appear to consciously create reality, to read the environment with clarity, to anticipate what moves in silence, to influence without forcing, to heal what the body expresses, to stop living blindly within a system that is always responding to your internal state. Each chapter of this journey unveils one of these powers from a deep, metaphysical, and vibratory perspective, not as an isolated ability, but as an expression of the same principle. Consciousness creates according to the frequency from which it operates. And when that frequency rises and stabilizes, perception changes, reality reorganizes, and what previously seemed impossible begins to feel logical. This is not a path for superficial, curious people. It is for those who feel that there is something more operating behind the visible. For those who know that attraction is not coincidence, that manifestation is not luck, and that true power is not in controlling the world, but in aligning with the field that creates it. If you decide to continue, you will not only know what those powers are, you will understand why they are activated, what they are for, and what responsibility awakening them implies. Because when consciousness awakens, nothing is ever the same again. And the greatest risk is no longer not having power. It is using it without knowing it. Chapter 1. Frequency defines perception. The first hidden power, perceiving beyond the visible. Before talking about any power, we must understand a truth that sustains everything. You do not perceive reality as it is. You perceive it according to the frequency from which you vibrate. Consciousness is not a neutral mirror. It is an active filter, and that filter determines what you see, what you ignore, and what never reaches your field of experience. This is the first hidden power, the ability to perceive more information when the internal frequency changes. It is not about seeing invisible things or hearing hidden voices. It is about noticing what was always there, but previously went unnoticed. Intentions, opportunities, tensions, synchronicities, signals. Reality constantly emits information, but only tuned consciousness can capture it. Think about something every day. Two people enter the same place. One feels discomfort without knowing why. The other perceives nothing. Or imagine an apparently normal conversation. The words are correct. The tone is kind. But something doesn't fit. Without clear evidence, an internal sensation arises that says, "There is something more here." That is not thought. It is perception filtering through when the frequency is open, enough to capture what is not said. When the frequency is low, perception becomes narrow. Everything seems like threat, lack, or effort. The same situations repeat, the same people appear, the same results return. Not because the world is limited, but because consciousness is always tuned to the same range. Change the frequency and the world seems different, not because it changed outside, but because now more is seen. This power begins to awaken when internal noise decreases, when the mind stops reacting to everything, when emotion stops dominating. In that relative silence, perception expands. You begin to feel the environment, to read a conversation before it ends, to notice when something flows and when it doesn't, not as thought, as immediate sensation. Perhaps you have already experienced it. That moment when you decide not to accept a proposal without being able to fully explain it, or when you choose to speak with someone at the right moment and the conversation changes the course of something important. It wasn't luck, it was active perception, operating without you yet recognizing it as power. Here, an important myth breaks. Perceiving more does not make you more spiritual, it makes you more responsible. Because you begin to notice when you are misaligned, when you force, when you act from fear. This power does not serve to escape reality, it serves to move better within it, to avoid mistakes before making them, to choose with greater precision. The training begins simply. Enter a place and notice how the body responds before thinking. Listen to someone and perceive what is behind the words. Make small decisions from the sensation of expansion or contraction, not from mental rush. At first, it seems subtle, then it becomes clear. And over time, this reading stops feeling like effort, it becomes natural. When this power begins to activate, something becomes evident. Information does not always arrive in words. It arrives as sudden clarity, as discomfort, as silent certainty. And there an inevitable question is born. If now you perceive more, how do you correctly interpret what you perceive? That question opens the next chapter where one of the most misunderstood powers of all is revealed, the so-called opening of the third eye. Not as mystical vision, but as the ability to decode the information you are already receiving. Chapter 2. The third eye does not see, it interprets. The second hidden power, decoding what you already perceive. When the third eye is mentioned, many imagine visions, lights, or hidden images. But that idea has misled entire generations. The third eye is not a literal eye. It does not appear to show invisible scenes. It appears to clearly interpret the information that is already reaching your field of consciousness. Seeing beyond does not mean seeing things. It means understanding beforehand, comprehending a situation without anyone explaining it, knowing what is really happening behind a conversation, a proposal, or an opportunity. That sudden understanding does not arrive as elaborate thought. It arrives as silent certainty. And that certainty is the true language of the third eye. Think of a common scene. You receive an offer that apparently is perfect. The words sound good, the promises fit, the numbers seem correct. However, something doesn't quite close. There is no clear reason, no data against it, only an internal clarity that says, this is not it, or something is missing here. Days later, the information appears that confirms that initial sensation. That was not distrust. It was conscious interpretation operating before the evidence manifested. For centuries, it was intuited that there was an internal point where perception and understanding met. René Descartes called it the place where mind and consciousness unify, not as mysticism, but as a center of integration. Today, it is understood that this seeing is not visual, it is immediate decoding, the ability to unite scattered signals into a single, clear understanding. Here, a crucial distinction appears. Imagining is not perceiving. Imagining is constructing from the mind. Perceiving is receiving without effort. When imagining, there is intention. When perceiving, there is openness. That is why forcing the opening of the third eye generates confusion. Mental images are created, sensations are fabricated, but there is no clarity. The real mistake has been trying to open it as if it were a physical door, when in reality it activates when the mind stops interfering. This power begins to awaken when you trust more in the understanding that arrives than in the analysis that is fabricated. When something is understood without reasoning it, when a situation is seen clearly without the need for arguments, that is the third eye operating not as fantasy, as integrative intelligence. Perhaps you already experienced it in an important conversation. Someone says the right thing, but the message does not match the energy, or in a decision that seemed logical, but internally felt wrong. The third eye does not judge, it interprets, it does not oppose, it clarifies. In daily practice, this power is strengthened when you learn to pause before concluding. Before a conversation, a proposal, or a decision, A brief internal silence is allowed, not to analyze, to let the information organize itself. Then, you observe what understanding appears first, not the most elaborate, the clearest. Over time, this reading becomes precise, and the difference between the real and the apparent becomes evident. When this power is activated, situations stop being confusing, people become readable, opportunities are recognized before being lost, and then something deeper happens. Interpretation begins to advance. Consciousness not only understands the present, it begins to feel where the future is moving. That is the threshold of the next power, where perception and interpretation become real anticipation. There begins the next chapter, true intuition, not as a hunch, but as anticipated reading of probabilities. Chapter 3. Intuition when the future is felt before. The third hidden power, reading probabilities before they become facts. Intuition does not appear out of nowhere. It is not magic or luck. It is advanced perception of the movement of energy. Before an event occurs, before a decision materializes, before a situation takes form, energy is already moving. And when consciousness is tuned, that movement is felt. That is why the future is not seen. It is felt not as an image, but as direction, as an internal signal that indicates where probabilities are leaning. The mistake has been believing that the future is something fixed. In reality, it is a dynamic field that is constantly reorganizing according to the internal states from which decisions are made and actions are taken. Surely you have experienced something like this. You are about to accept an important decision, a job, a relationship, an investment. Everything seems logical. Everything fits on paper. But there is an internal sensation that does not accompany. It is not fear. It is not anxiety. It is a silent clarity that makes you uncomfortable. Many times it is ignored, and weeks or months later the result appears that confirms what had already been felt from the beginning. That was intuition, reading a trajectory before traveling it. Here, a fundamental key is revealed. Internal states not only affect the present, they open or close timelines. Each decision made from fear, urgency, or active clarity activates different trajectories. Intuition is the ability to perceive those trajectories before entering them, not to guess the future, but to choose with greater precision. Henri Bergson explained that intuition is a form of direct knowledge of the movement of reality prior to logical thought. It is not an impulsive emotion, it is immediate contact with the flow of time. That is why it arrives quickly and why the mind usually doubts it. Here, a crucial distinction appears. Intuition is not fear. Fear is noisy, insistent, and accelerated. Intuition is silent, clear, and does not need to justify itself. Fear pushes. Intuition guides. Fear demands immediate action. Intuition allows pause. Internal vibration is decisive. When the state is chaotic, intuition is distorted, it is confused with anxiety, desire, or projection. But when there is coherence, intuition becomes precise. Decisions begin to feel right even before understanding them. And many times the mistake is perceived before making it. This power is trained by observing the first sensations before a decision, not the rationalized ones. The first bodily impression, expansion or contraction, lightness or weight. Then, do not act immediately. Allow a few hours to pass. If the sensation remains clear and stable, it is intuition. If it becomes urgent or anxious, it is noise. Over time, this reading becomes reliable. When intuition truly activates, something deeper happens. Probabilities are no longer just read. They begin to be modified. Because choosing from clarity changes the trajectory, and sustaining a coherent internal state reorganizes what is coming. That is the threshold of the next power, where consciousness stops anticipating and begins to order events. There begins the next chapter, the so-called telekinesis, not as movement of objects, but as real influence over what happens. Chapter 4. Telekinesis does not move objects, it moves events. The fourth hidden power, ordering the field where things happen. The word telekinesis has been misinterpreted for too long. It was imagined as moving objects with the mind, as a spectacular act. But that is not the true phenomenon. Reality is not pushed, it is ordered, and when internal order changes, events rearrange themselves. The mind does not have to force anything. When it tries to do so, it generates resistance. What really transforms matter is not mental pressure, but the coherence of the internal state. Reality responds to fields, to patterns, to energetic configurations. That is why two people with the same desire obtain different results. They do not desire from the same state. Perhaps you have experienced it without calling it power. Think of a stage where everything seemed to get stuck. Emails that did not respond, meetings that were canceled, opportunities that never materialized. Then, without changing the external strategy, something internal is ordered. Urgency drops, clarity appears, you stop chasing, and suddenly the responses arrive. The meeting reactivates, someone casually calls, the opportunity returns. But in better terms, the action did not change. The field from which you were acting changed. Here, a key truth appears. Internal states produce synchronicities, unexpected encounters, opportunities that appear without being sought, decisions of others that align without explanation. They are not miracles. They are signs that the field reorganized. The true meaning of moving matter is not displacing objects. It is altering the probability of events so that certain results become more accessible than others. This understanding was intuited by minds that understood the nature of the field before its form. As Nikola Tesla suggested, if you understand frequency and vibration, you understand the behavior of reality. Here, that idea stops being theory. It becomes direct experience. When the internal state stabilizes, the environment begins to respond with coherence. In everyday life, this power becomes visible when you stop chasing results and begin to care for the state from which you act. Conversations that previously became tense flow, proposals that previously fell through advance, people who previously did not respond appear. Money does not arrive because you ask for it. It arrives when the internal field stops emitting urgency. Attraction is not a mental magnet, it is a silent reorganization. Moving events requires responsibility. Forcing never works. Insisting exhausts. Instead, sustaining clarity, calm, and internal direction orders the field, and that order is reflected outside as useful coincidences. It is not about controlling others, it is about aligning the point from which you interact with reality. When this power begins to activate, something else becomes evident. Not only do events change, you begin to notice where they are heading. Trajectories become readable. You feel when something is going to prosper and when it is not. That advanced reading is not simple intuition, it is access to a deeper level where the future shows itself as a flexible field. That is the threshold of the next power. When events are ordered, time stops being linear. There begins the next chapter, precognition. Not as prophecy, but as conscious reading of energetic trajectories before they become inevitable. Chapter 5. Precognition. The future as a modifiable field. The fifth hidden power, recognizing where reality is leaning. The future is not a straight line waiting for you to arrive. It is a dynamic field that is constantly reorganizing. Before something happens, it exists as tendency, as possibility and formation. And when consciousness becomes refined, that inclination begins to be felt even when nothing is evident. Precognition does not consist of guessing events or receiving advanced images. It consists of reading directions, perceiving where energy is moving when nothing has been decided yet. That is why some people seem to anticipate facts, not because they see the future, but because they capture the previous movement that originates it. Perhaps you have experienced it in a more subtle way. You are advancing in a routine you already know, work, schedules, the same conversations. Nothing bad happens, but a persistent sensation of stagnation begins to appear. It is not clear dissatisfaction. It is an internal perception that something is about to be exhausted. Days or weeks later, without having sought it, an external change arises, a closure, a different opportunity, an inevitable decision. The future was already leaning, and consciousness perceived it before it took form. Here, a fundamental understanding appears. The future is not written, it is probabilized. Each internal state activates certain trajectories and discards others. The same scenario can develop in completely different ways according to the vibration from which it is traversed. Changing vibration is not a symbolic act. It is altering the course of the field that is unfolding. This idea was explored by David Bohm, who explained that visible reality emerges from a deeper order where everything remains in relation. At that level, the future does not appear as something distant, but as implicit information contained in the present. Consciousness does not create from nothing, it chooses which possibility to allow to become dominant. That is why reading the future is only clear when the internal state is ordered. Urgent desire distorts, fear narrows, anxiety confuses. Instead, when there is coherence, direction becomes evident, not as logical reasoning, but as a sustained sensation of advancement or warning, an internal signal that does not need explanation. From there, decisions begin to change, not by impulse, by alignment. You stop sustaining dynamics that no longer advance. Internal resistance is reduced, and that adjustment modifies the complete course of what is coming, not because the future obeys, but because it responds to the state that is maintained over time. Here it is understood why some people repeat the same outcomes over and over again. It is not bad luck, it is vibratory coherence. The same state produces the same probability, and as long as that state does not transform, the future will continue leaning toward the same place. However, there is a crucial point. The trajectory can be perceived, the direction can be adjusted, but if the body does not accompany that change, the new line does not consolidate. Energy needs physical and emotional support to sustain itself. There, the next threshold opens. For the future to really be modified, the body must align with the new frequency. That is the territory of the next chapter, healing. Not as elimination of symptoms, but as the deep ordering of the energy that the body is expressing. Chapter 6. Healing, ordering the energy that the body expresses. The sixth hidden power, embodied vibratory coherence. For a long time, healing was understood as the elimination of a symptom, removing pain, silencing discomfort, correcting what does not work. But that view was always incomplete. The body does not fail. The body expresses, and what it expresses does not appear randomly. Each symptom is information. Each sustained tension is detained energy. Each deep fatigue speaks of an internal state that has not been integrated. Emotion, energy, and body are not separate things. They are the same movement seen from different levels. When an emotion is not processed, it densifies. When energy does not flow, it stagnates. And when it stagnates, the body shows it. Perhaps you have experienced it without relating it to healing. Days when everything is fine, but the body feels heavy. Pains that always appear at the same moments. Contractures that return when there is pressure. Insomnia just when you try to sustain more than you can. It is not weakness, it is coherence. The body is expressing exactly the state that has been inhabited in silence. Here, an uncomfortable but liberating truth is revealed. Healing is not eliminating, it is integrating. The body does not ask to be attacked, it asks to be heard. That is why fighting against the symptom usually reinforces it, while understanding the state that originated it begins to dissolve it. The symptom is not the enemy, it is the final message of something that began much earlier. This understanding was developed by Wilhelm Reich, who observed that the body keeps the complete emotional history of the individual. Chronic tensions, respiratory blocks, and rigidity were not physical failures, but sustained energetic memories. The body, as a map, shows exactly where energy stopped moving. When this power begins to activate, the approach changes. Instead of asking, "What do I have?" another deeper question arises. What state am I sustaining? Constant stress, self-demand, silent fear, unexpressed guilt. The body responds faithfully to that internal climate. It does not punish, it regulates. In everyday life, this ordering occurs when you stop ignoring the signals, when you breathe where there is tension instead of rushing it, when you lower the pace without guilt, when you allow yourself to feel what was postponed. Sometimes just internally recognizing this overwhelms me, generates more relief than any technique. It is not about great rituals, but about coherence. When the internal state softens, the body responds, and when the body responds, energy begins to circulate again. Many blockages repeat, not because the body is weak, but because the internal state has not changed. The effect is treated, but the cause is maintained. That is why some people improve and then relapse. Real healing does not occur when the symptom disappears. It occurs when the state that generated it is no longer necessary. When the body enters coherence, something deeper happens. Perception expands, sensitivity increases, consciousness stops feeling trapped in form. The body stops being a limit and becomes a support point. When the body aligns, consciousness expands, and that expansion leads to an even more misunderstood power, astral projection, not as escape from the body, but as deep disidentification from form. Chapter 7. Astral projection, disidentification from form, the seventh hidden power, non-localized consciousness. Astral projection has been surrounded by myths, exaggerations, and misunderstandings. It was imagined as leaving the body, traveling through planes, or escaping reality. But that approach always pointed to the wrong place. It is not about abandoning the body, it is about abandoning identification with it. The physical self is a reference, an anchor point, but it is not the limit of consciousness. When attention is fixed exclusively on the body, identity becomes rigid. Presence is confused with form. Authentic astral projection begins when that confusion dissolves, when consciousness stops feeling trapped in a specific location and recognizes itself as observer. Perhaps you have already experienced something similar without naming it. Moments of high emotional pressure, an intense discussion, unexpected news, a situation where everything seemed to overwhelm you, and suddenly, without seeking it, an instant of internal distance occurs. You are still there, the body is present, but you are no longer absorbed by the emotion. You observe what happens with a strange calm. It is not indifference, it is clarity. In that moment, you did not escape, you stopped identifying. This state was described since antiquity as the silent witness. Deep traditions understood that consciousness can observe thoughts, sensations, and emotions without merging with them, not as evasion, but as lucidity. Here you are not seeking to go to another place, you are seeking to be without being trapped. That is why there is a clear danger in this power. Confusing imagination with expansion, creating mental scenes, fabricated sensations, or movement fantasies. That is not projection, that is active mind. True expansion occurs when the mind quiets and presence deepens. There are no spectacular images, there is amplitude, silence, stability. This power manifests as deep states of presence, moments where the body is still there, but stops being the center, where sensations appear without dragging, where thoughts are observed without intervening. At that point, consciousness is not in the body, it is through it. The training is simple and subtle. Seek a space of stillness. Bring attention to the body without trying to change it. Notice the breath, the contact. Then open attention to sounds, not to what they mean, to the fact of listening. Then observe thoughts as events that appear and disappear, and then formulate internally a question without seeking an answer. From where am I observing all this? It is not answered with words. You allow attention to expand. A sensation of space may arise, of not being contained in a form. If the mind returns, there's no mistake. It is also observed. The practice is not to go far. It is not to identify again. Over time, this state becomes accessible even in the middle of the day, in a difficult conversation, in an important decision. Consciousness observes without getting lost, and there a new freedom begins, not because the world changes, but because you no longer confuse yourself with each form that appears. This power does not serve to flee from life. It serves to see it clearly without being trapped. When identification is released, fear decreases, reactivity falls, and something deeper begins to emerge. There, the last threshold opens. When consciousness frees itself from form, it stops operating from the isolated individual and begins to interact with something greater, the field. That is the territory of the final chapter, the true hidden power, consciously manifesting from the vibratory field, not by effort, by alignment. Chapter 8, the true hidden power, manifesting from the field when all powers unify. After traveling through perception, interpretation, intuition, influence over events, reading the future, coherence of the body, and disidentification from form, a truth appears that orders everything. The true hidden power is not an isolated ability. It is the capacity to consciously manifest from the vibratory field where everything originates. The field is not an abstract concept or a distant place. It is the level where thought, emotion, energy, and consciousness stop operating separately. It is the invisible matrix that precedes all form. From there, results are not created by effort, but by sustained coherence. Perhaps you have experienced it in simple moments, stages where you stop insisting, pushing, chasing, not because you give up, but because internally something is ordered. You begin to act with calm, clarity, and confidence. And without changing too much externally, things begin to accommodate. A call arrives without seeking it. A response appears without pressure. A problem that seemed big resolves itself almost alone. It was not luck, it was alignment. The field responded to the state you began to inhabit. Here it is understood why real attraction does not require struggle. When the internal state is stable, reality does not need to be pushed. It reorganizes. Opportunities are not chased. They present themselves. Encounters are not forced. They align. It does not happen because someone asks, but because the field responds to the state that is sustained over time. This vision was expressed clearly by Max Planck when he affirmed that matter does not exist as a fundamental entity, but as a result of an intelligent force that sustains it. At that deep level, consciousness does not interact with isolated objects, it interacts with the order that generates them. Manifesting is not moving pieces, it is allowing a coherent order to express itself without interference. That is why seeking separate powers always led to frustration, intuition without stability, influence without integration, healing without presence. The field does not respond to fragments, it responds to complete states. When vibration is sustained, all the so-called powers emerge, not as abilities, but as natural functions of aligned consciousness. Here the most common mistake is also revealed, trying to use power from the ego, wanting to control results without understanding the field that generates resistance. Power is not activated by will, it is embodied by coherence. And when it is embodied, it stops feeling like power. It is lived as expanded normality. Let's practice the activation of this power. Seek a moment of stillness, not to do something, to be. Bring attention to the breath without modifying it. Notice the body, the space, the silence between thoughts. Release all idea of asking, visualizing, or directing. Remain only in the sensation of stability as if nothing were missing, as if everything were already contained. From that state, allow a single phrase to arise internally, without effort. From here, I let reality order itself. Do not expect immediate signals, do not analyze results. This training does not seek to produce, it seeks to establish the point from which manifestation occurs. When this state becomes familiar, manifestation stops being a conscious act and becomes a natural consequence of the field you inhabit. You do not awaken powers, you awaken your capacity to create. This journey was not created to promise extraordinary abilities. It was created to show what happens when consciousness stops operating in a fragmented way. When the internal state is ordered, the body aligns and presence stabilizes. Reality begins to respond without friction. Powers do not appear to impress or to demonstrate superiority. They appear when vibration becomes coherent with what you want to experience. When the internal state stops fluctuating, the world stops resisting, and what previously seemed like coincidence is revealed as natural consequence. Here, a learning does not end. A different way of living opens, one where you do not chase, do not force, and do not beg. You inhabit, and from that place, creation occurs with clarity, fluidity, and depth. This content is just a door. On this channel, you will find other journeys designed to go beyond the evident, beyond the repeated, and beyond what few dare to explain. Each work deepens into what truly transforms, not to believe more, but to see with greater clarity and create with greater consciousness. If this resonated with you, if you felt something shift inside, subscribe to this channel. There's so much more waiting for you here, knowledge that goes deeper, truths that most won't share, and perspectives that will change how you see reality itself. Don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe now and continue this journey of awakening with us.